I was discussing with the choir earlier whether that was so powerful that I just didn't need to preach a sermon today and we could all go home. But we decided that since you're already here and I already have it written, we'll go ahead. Our scripture this morning is from Paul's beautiful prayer for the Ephesians in chapter 3, verses 14 to 21. For this reason, I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth takes its name. I pray that according to the riches of his glory, he may grant that you may be strengthened in your inner being with power through his Spirit, and that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, as you are being rooted and grounded in love. I pray that you may have the power to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, so that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. Now to him who by the power at work within us is able to accomplish abundantly far more than all we can ask or imagine. To him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus to all generations, forever and ever. Amen. That could be a sermon in itself. We never imagine that a disaster is going to happen to us. We see over and over on the news hurricanes and earthquakes and fires and floods, and our hearts ache for people in the midst of the storm. But usually, the news is out there and we are safely here. Although once in a while, our sense of safety is shattered and we find ourselves or our loved ones in the path of danger, like last fall when Hurricane Florence threatened to sweep over Raleigh. When you are the one in the middle of the storm, whether it's the sudden arrival of a natural disaster, the violence of war, or the slow threat of poverty, it can be hard to imagine that anyone cares or is going to help. Disaster is isolating, both mentally and literally. Often after a storm or in the middle of war, communication is cut off and roads are not passable. Many in those situations don't have phones or internet, and even if they did, they might not have the right people to call for help. And so it's easy to feel alone and forgotten, and difficult to imagine a way forward. But we are people who believe that God does far more than we can imagine. That what is possible is not limited to our own knowledge. In today's passage from Ephesians, the word translated imagine comes from the Greek neeo, which isn't just whatever we can dream up, but it refers to anything the mind can possibly grasp, anything that can be understood or explained or thought up with our minds. By the power at work within us, God is able to accomplish far more than we can ever possibly explain or understand. So we may not ever be able to truly know the astounding power of God's love, but I believe that we can experience that love for ourselves. We feel it when we receive unexpected compassion and care from someone else. And we feel it when we share unconditional, life-giving love with another person. What a strange and wonderful gift that God's love, which is far beyond our ability to understand, can be known when we give it and receive it ourselves. That we are the vessels of that incomprehensible force. Today we celebrate our annual offering to Week of Compassion, which is the Relief and Refugee and Development Fund of the Disciples of Christ. that partners around the world with people to alleviate suffering and to share God's love in ways that surpass knowledge. I could not have imagined the ways that my own life would be changed by Gifts to Week of Compassion. Many of you might know that before I went to seminary, I lived in Sri Lanka for 2 years as a global mission intern. And those positions are funded by Week of Compassion offerings. So even though there are many more recent disasters and responses from Week of Compassion that we could talk about this morning, it has such a long-standing impact on my own faith and calling that I wanted to share some of those stories with you today, so you could know firsthand what a difference, what a long-term, lasting difference these gifts really make. In Sri Lanka, I worked with a partner church denomination, the Church of South India, and taught English at a school in the rural northern part of the country. And at that time, northern Sri Lanka had been devastated by more than 2 decades of civil war. And so even though there was a temporary ceasefire in place, most people could not imagine that a lasting peace would ever be achieved. After years of war that hurt economic development and disrupted education and pushed many people off of their land, many people lived in poverty. They couldn't imagine having a way to improve their income and to help their children build a better future. And on top of that, you may remember that in 2004, Sri Lanka was hit by a devastating tsunami that wiped out entire villages along the coast. And so with houses destroyed as far as they could see, and many people grieving their loved ones and neighbors, they couldn't imagine rebuilding and starting life over again. But we know that the good news is that God, by the power at work within us, is able to do more than we can imagine. God's love is vast and deep and can connect people across distance, people who would never have a chance to meet, whose daily life is completely foreign to each other. We might struggle to imagine what that would be like to live with so many challenges. To stand in the ruins of your home without an insurance company to call or FEMA to apply to for help, no income or work available. Even with those resources, we know that recovery is extremely challenging. But when we give to help with relief through groups like Week of Compassion, we can imagine the feeling of hope that those gifts might bring. We can imagine not just what we see on the news of the destruction, but communities rebuilding, food and supplies being shared, God's love being experienced across the distance. When we put together school kits and hygiene kits, like we did last year for Church World Service, kits that we sent to people on the coast of North Carolina after Hurricane Florence, we can imagine kids receiving those kits and going back to school and starting to learn again and things getting back to normal. The breadth and length and height and depth of Christ's love becomes a little bit easier to understand when we see it in new notebooks and pencils, in roofs and clean clothes, in the compassion of strangers who care about your suffering and your loss, who remind you that you do not face this alone. As I served in Sri Lanka, the vastness and the power of God's love became real to me as I saw lives changed firsthand and experienced how that love could transcend distance and language and culture and religion. There were some times when I got to be on the receiving end of that love. There were many people I met who cared for me while I lived so far from home. Some of my most meaningful relationships were with 18 young women who were living in a girls' home that was run by the church. A few of the girls were orphans, and others were from families that were too poor or too sick to take care of them. And at a time when I was also living far from my family, they became my sisters. They accepted me as one of them and never let me spend a holiday or a meal alone, because they were always willing to invite me over and share whatever they had. And I didn't have to do anything to earn their love. Most of the time we just played games or sang or admired pictures of their favorite Indian movie stars and found ways to communicate even without the same language. I also got a lot of inspiration and mentoring from some of the local pastors there, whose example and whose faithfulness first made me want to be a minister. Reverend Joshua, in particular, showed me what it looks like to truly make a difference as a pastor. He saw people in the village around his church suffering, and regardless of whether they were Christian or Hindu, he found a way to help them. And so watching pastors like Joshua serve their communities, I began to feel a call in my own spirit. Other times, I had the privilege of standing in the middle, being a witness of how God's love changed lives by seeing the gifts given here put to use in that place. Because We Give Compassion partners with local organizations who have been in the country in need for a long time, they're able to do more and do it quickly because there are already people in place on the ground who know what the needs are. In the village of Cholipuram in northern Sri Lanka, the people mostly earn their living as fishermen. And so the tsunami came and swept away their boats that they used to earn a living. So they couldn't even earn the $3 a day that they made before that was barely allowing them to meet their needs. Now, many in this community had already been displaced from their homes by the war, and so they'd had to move and build makeshift houses out of palm leaves and mud on other people's land, and many of them were also afflicted with leprosy. And so before the tsunami, Pastor Joshua had been working in this community trying to organize people into cooperatives where they could save their money to buy their own land and build permanent homes and try to address some of their health needs. But when they lost their boats in the tsunami, it seemed like this dream would be impossible. But generous donors heard the news about the tsunami and they responded, and so they were able to not only replace their boats, but they received enough in recovery to buy new fiberglass boats with motors. And each boat was shared by 3 families. And so working together, these fishermen were able to go out deeper into the water with their new boats and to catch more fish than they had before, and so their income doubled. They began pooling their resources so they could buy the land and build their new homes more quickly. They could not have imagined that facing yet another disaster would actually make their lives better. But through the power of Christ working in people across the world they had never met, they were able to do far more than they thought possible. Sometimes we're able to share what we have with others in ways that help us experience the depth of God's love beyond what we knew was possible. Through giving, we experience the fullness of God at work in us. When I left home for Sri Lanka as a young woman, I didn't feel like I had any particular gifts or skills to offer. But I found that just because I was willing, I had a lot to give. Now, you may not believe it, but this was well before I ever became a runner. I wasn't athletic at all, no sports, nothing. But when I got to the school, I found myself coaching female students for the annual cross-country race. I had no idea what I was doing, but I did know that before this, every year, the girls would show up the morning of the race run and then collapse exhausted, which seems really unhealthy. So, not ever having run before myself, we would get up every morning for a month before the race and go on a little run through the village and the rice fields. And somehow, we all grew stronger. We all discovered that we were capable of more than we thought possible. There were many other occasions when I felt empowered to speak up for the female teachers and students, and in the process discovered my own voice and grew my own confidence in new ways. Over and over again, I was put in a position to lead in ways that I didn't know that I could. We may look at the needs around us, we may hear the stories of all the disasters and the war around the world, and feel helpless to make a difference. But our giving can create new possibilities, not just for others, but for ourselves too. We may discover that God's power is actually at work in us, accomplishing more than we could have imagined. That maybe our gifts are able to create a world in which all are fed, in which there is no more violence or injustice, where everyone has a safe place to call home. It may seem impossible. It may seem hard to imagine what that world would even be like. A world in which the vast reach of God's love is known, because we have given and received it. If you want to grow in faith and service, to be a part of giving and receiving God's love as a part of this church, then I would love to talk to you about baptism or joining St. Paul's anytime